The town hall buzzed with anticipation, attention so thick it could be cut with a knife. Rows of folding chairs filled the community center, each occupied by a mix of hopeful faces and weary expressions. The air conditioner rattled in the corner, barely keeping up with the heat radiating from the packed room. Angela Carter stood near the back, her eyes scanning the room as she clutched a worn leather notebook, the same notebook she'd carried to every meeting, protest, and hearing for the past decade. It was her armor, her weapon, her voice when words failed her. Tonight, she felt its familiar weight as she prepared for another battle, a battle she'd fought 1,000 times before. At the front of the room, a panel of officials sat behind a long wooden table. Among them was Mayor Weston, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wore a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Beside him sat his son, Jordan, his tailored suit and smug demeanor screaming privilege. Jordan's presence wasn't required at a meeting like this, but everyone knew why he was there, to remind the community of his family's influence. "Let's get started," Mayor Weston said, tapping his microphone. His voice carried a false cheerfulness that grated on Angela's nerves. "We're here to discuss community safety and hear your concerns." A young man stood up from the crowd. His name was Marcus Green, a passionate community leader in his early 20s. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he gripped the microphone. "We've been talking about safety for years," Marcus began, his tone measured but firm. "But safety doesn't mean the same thing for all of us. For some of us, it means not being targeted by the very people who are supposed to protect us." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of agreement and discomfort. Angela's eyes locked on Marcus, silently willing him to keep going. He was young, but his words carried the weight of generations. Before Marcus could continue, Jordan leaned back in his chair and let out a scoff loud enough to turn heads. "Oh, here we go again," he said, rolling his eyes. "The same tired narrative. Maybe if people followed the law, they wouldn't have anything to worry about." The room went silent. All eyes were on Marcus, whose jaw tightened. Angela felt her pulse quicken. She'd seen this before, the subtle provocation, the smug dismissal. It was a dance Jordan had perfected, one designed to discredit and demean. Marcus stepped forward, his voice rising. "Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And I won't stand here and let you—" Before he could finish, a police officer standing near the door interrupted. "That's enough," the officer barked, his hand resting on his belt. Angela felt her stomach churn. The officer's presence, the dismissive smirk on Jordan's face, it was all too familiar. And deep down, she knew this night was about to spiral into something none of them could take back. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The room was a kaleidoscope of emotions, anger, fear, hope, all simmering beneath the surface as Angela Carter took a seat toward the back. The community center, though modest, had always been a space of resistance and dialogue. Its scuffed linoleum floors and faded posters on the walls told stories of countless meetings just like this one. Meetings where voices were raised, tears were shed, and promises were made, some fulfilled, but most forgotten. Angela let her eyes wander across the room. Mothers with young children perched on their laps sat near the front, their faces lined with exhaustion. Older men, veterans of the civil rights movement, nodded silently as Marcus Green's words lingered in the air. And then there were the skeptics, faces tight with doubt, arms crossed in a posture that screamed disillusionment. She understood their wariness. After all, promises of change often dissolved into thin air. Angela shifted in her seat, the leather notebook in her lap grounding her as she scribbled quick notes. Her mind raced, recalling the battles that had brought her here. As a lawyer and lifelong activist, Angela had spent her career fighting for people like Marcus. She'd stood in countless courtrooms, battling for justice in a system rigged against them. But tonight wasn't about her. It was about Marcus and the community that had raised him. He was the embodiment of their hopes, their fight, their future. Her gaze settled on Marcus as he stood at the microphone, his broad shoulders squared and his eyes burning with conviction. His words rang out like a rallying cry, piercing through the tension in the room. "We're not asking for favors. We're demanding what's owed to us: respect, fairness, and accountability." Angela felt a swell of pride. Marcus reminded her of herself when she was younger, unwavering, unyielding. But there was a vulnerability in him too, one that made her protective. He didn't have the armor she'd built over years of fighting. He hadn't yet learned that courage often comes with scars. Near the panel at the front of the room, Mayor Weston sat flanked by his aides and his son, Jordan. The contrast between the two was striking. The mayor wore the polished, rehearsed expression of a seasoned politician, nodding along as though he cared. Jordan, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, his arms draped casually over the sides. His smirk was a silent declaration of his detachment from the gravity of the conversation. Angela's stomach churned as she watched Jordan. He was everything wrong with this town, a walking embodiment of privilege and impunity. His presence at the meeting wasn't just unnecessary, it was an insult, a reminder of the power imbalance they were up against. Angela's attention shifted as the police officer stationed by the door stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded authority, but his body language was stiff, his posture rigid. His hand rested near his belt, not as a threat, but as a silent signal of control. He scanned the room, his eyes landing briefly on Angela before moving to Marcus. "Why does he look like he's waiting for a fight?" Angela thought, her fingers tightening around her pen. She knew this pattern all too well, the unspoken alliance between privilege and power. Tonight, it wasn't just about words, it was about the silent forces ready to suppress them. The murmur of voices grew louder as Marcus continued speaking. "We're not the enemy," he said, his voice rising. "But if you treat us like one, don't expect us to stay silent." Jordan let out a loud chuckle, earning glares from several attendees. "Maybe if you stopped playing the victim, you'd actually get somewhere," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Angela's heart sank. The room tensed, a collective inhale as the insult hung in the air. She could feel the storm brewing, the kind that didn't dissipate without leaving scars. It wasn't just Jordan's words, it was the weight of centuries of injustice they carried. And in that moment, Angela knew tonight would be the kind of night that changed everything. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. All eyes shifted between Marcus and Jordan, the young activist and the mayor's son, two figures standing on opposite sides of a divide that had existed long before either of them was born. Angela sat on the edge of her seat, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the tension thickening, wrapping around the room like an unrelenting fog. Marcus, still gripping the microphone, took a deep breath. His voice, though steady, carried the tremor of restrained anger. "What you just said isn't just disrespectful, it's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps communities like ours under attack. We're not playing victims. We're demanding accountability." Jordan leaned forward in his chair, his smirk morphing into a mocking grin. "Accountability?" he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why don't you start by taking responsibility for your own failures? You can't blame the system for everything." A few audible gasps rippled through the crowd. Angela felt the familiar churn of rage in her stomach, but she kept her face impassive. This was Jordan's tactic, dismissive arrogance designed to bait people into losing their composure. It worked far too often. Marcus, however, held his ground. "Failures?" he shot back, his voice firm. "You mean the system that's failed us? The one that over-polices our neighborhoods but underfunds our schools? The one that protects people like you while criminalizing people like me?" The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, punctuated by scattered claps. Angela noticed the officer by the door shift uncomfortably, his hand moving closer to his belt. Her chest tightened. She had seen these situations escalate too many times before, and they rarely ended well for people like Marcus. Jordan shrugged nonchalantly, his grin unfazed. "Maybe if you didn't act like criminals, you wouldn't be treated like criminals," he said with a casualness that stung more than a shouted insult ever could. That was the moment the room broke. Several people stood up, shouting at Jordan. Marcus stepped closer to the panel, his face flushed with indignation. "You don't get to talk to us like that," he yelled, the weight of generations of frustration cracking through his measured demeanor. "Sit down, sir," the police officer barked, stepping forward with his hand now resting fully on his holster. The room fell silent again, but this time the air was electric with fear. The officer's tone was sharp, almost rehearsed, as if he were waiting for an excuse to assert his authority. Angela's heart pounded. She stood instinctively, her voice cutting through the silence. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said, stepping toward Marcus. "He's speaking the truth, and that's not a crime." The officer turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, sit down or I'll have you escorted out." Jordan chuckled from his seat, clearly enjoying the chaos he had orchestrated. "Let them keep talking," he said lazily, addressing no one in particular. "It's entertaining, watching them dig their own graves." Marcus pointed an accusatory finger at Jordan. "You think this is a joke? People are dying because of policies your family upholds, but I guess that's easy to ignore from where you're sitting." The officer moved closer to Marcus, his posture rigid and his face set like stone. "Step back, now," he ordered, his hand hovering dangerously close to his baton. The crowd's energy shifted from frustration to fear, and Angela could see it in Marcus's eyes. The split-second realization that he was a young black man standing too close to an armed authority figure. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a gesture of de-escalation. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice calmer now, but still resolute. But it wasn't enough. In a flash, the officer grabbed Marcus by the arm. "I said step back," the officer barked, his voice booming. And then it happened. Without warning, the officer's fist connected with Marcus's jaw in a sickening thud. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, screams, and shouts filled the air as Marcus stumbled back, clutching his face. Angela felt a surge of rage and fear unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This wasn't just an assault on Marcus. It was an assault on everything she and her community had fought for. And as the officer stood there, his fist still clenched, Angela knew this moment would be the catalyst. The world was about to hear their story, whether they wanted to or not. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing second, the tension wrapping itself around everyone present. Marcus Green, the young activist at the microphone, was no longer speaking to the mayor or his son. His words had become a rallying cry for the dozens of people seated in the community center, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of hope and anger. Marcus's voice rang out, steady yet charged. "We're tired of being treated like second-class citizens. We're tired of being spoken down to, dismissed, and ignored. This isn't about asking for favors. This is about demanding what's ours: justice and equality." His words drew nods from many in the audience. Angela Carter, seated near the back, felt a swell of pride for the young man. He was courageous, standing in the face of power and privilege with nothing but his voice and conviction. Yet Angela couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. She'd seen this dynamic play out before. Passion met with resistance, truth drowned out by arrogance. At the front of the room, Mayor Weston sat stone-faced, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. To his left, his son Jordan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression one of boredom barely masking disdain. Jordan's eyes flicked lazily over Marcus, as if evaluating whether the young activist was worth his attention. Then, with a loud and deliberate scoff, Jordan tilted his head and spoke. "You've got some nerve, Marcus," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the murmurs in the room. "Always so quick to point fingers. Maybe if you people took some responsibility for your actions, you wouldn't be in this position." The room froze. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a murmur of disbelief and outrage. Angela felt her fists clench, her nails digging into her palm. She knew Jordan's type: entitled, untouchable, and utterly indifferent to the pain his words could cause. Marcus, however, stood his ground. His jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Responsibility?" he said, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. "How about we talk about the system that makes sure people like me are always at a disadvantage? How about we talk about the privileges you were born into, Jordan, and the way your family profits off our struggles?" Jordan smirked, unbothered. "Spare me the lecture," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Maybe if you stopped playing the victim card, you'd actually get somewhere." The tension in the room became unbearable. Several people stood, shouting at Jordan. A woman near the front yelled, "How dare you talk like that?" Another man added, "This is exactly why nothing changes." The energy had shifted from simmering frustration to boiling rage. Angela's eyes darted to the police officer stationed by the door. His posture was tense now, his hand hovering near his belt. Her stomach sank. She'd seen this before. The officer wasn't there to protect the community. He was there to protect the status quo. "Calm down, everyone," the officer barked, stepping forward. His voice was sharp, his body language aggressive. "Sit down and let's keep this civil." Marcus turned toward him, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm calm," he said firmly. "I'm just telling the truth, and if that makes people uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves why." But the officer wasn't interested in listening. "Step away from the panel," he ordered, his tone hardening. "Now." Angela could see it happening before it even began. The escalating confrontation, the misuse of power, the inevitable outcome. She stood, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said, stepping forward. "He's exercising his right to speak." The officer turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Sit down, ma'am, or you'll be removed." Jordan's laugh cut through the tension, cruel and mocking. "Let him keep talking," he said, leaning back in his chair. It's entertaining watching him dig his own grave." Marcus's eyes burned with anger, but before he could respond, the officer moved closer, his hand resting on his baton. "This is your final warning," the officer said, his voice low and menacing. And then it happened. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus by the arm. The young man tried to pull away, but the officer's fist connected with his jaw, the sound of the impact echoing through the room. Marcus stumbled back, clutching his face as a collective gasp filled the air. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. The room erupted into chaos. Shouts, screams, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. She moved toward Marcus instinctively, her mind racing. This wasn't just an assault on him. It was an assault on all of them, on their fight, their voice, their dignity. As the officer stood there, his fist still clenched, Angela knew one thing for certain. This fight had only just begun. The room was chaos. The sound of the officer's punch seemed to echo endlessly, amplifying the shock and rage that spread like wildfire through the crowd. Angela froze for a split second, the weight of what she had just witnessed rendering her momentarily speechless. Then the noise erupted, shouts of protest, cries of disbelief, and the sharp scrape of chairs as people stood or rushed toward Marcus. Marcus stumbled back, clutching his jaw, his face a mix of pain and disbelief. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, staining the collar of his shirt. Angela snapped out of her daze and pushed through the crowd, her leather notebook clutched tightly in one hand. She had to get to Marcus. She had to make sure he was okay. "Marcus!" she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Angela said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. "You're okay. Just stay calm." But calm was nowhere to be found in the room. The crowd was on its feet, people yelling at the officer, at the mayor, at each other. "You can't do that," someone shouted. "That's assault," another voice called out. Angela turned and saw that Jordan Weston was still seated, smirking as if this were some kind of theater production put on for his amusement. "Everyone, back up," the officer bellowed, his hand now resting on his holster. The sight of his fingers grazing the weapon silenced some of the shouting, but the energy in the room was volatile, teetering on the edge of explosion. Angela spun around, her voice rising above the din. "Put your hand off your weapon," she shouted at the officer. "You've done enough damage for one night." The officer's eyes snapped to hers, his expression hard. "Step back, ma'am, or I'll have you detained, too." "Detained?" Angela repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "For what? For standing up to your abuse of power? You attacked an unarmed man for speaking his mind." "He was resisting," the officer snapped defensively, his voice faltering slightly as he glanced around the room. Several phones were now raised in the air, cameras recording every moment. Angela caught the flicker of realization in his eyes. He understood that this moment wouldn't be forgotten. Marcus straightened up beside her, still holding his jaw, but with renewed determination in his eyes. "You're lying," he said, loudly, addressing the officer. "I wasn't resisting. You know it, and everyone here knows it." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a collective wave of outrage. Angela seized the moment, her voice ringing out over the noise. "Everyone, keep recording. Don't stop until we have everything documented." Mayor Weston finally stood from his chair, raising his hands in a feigned gesture of authority. "Let's all settle down," he said, his voice calm but hollow. There's no need for this to escalate further." "Settle down?" Angela shot back, her voice cutting like a knife. She turned to face him, her finger pointed accusingly. "Your son sits here mocking our community. Your officer assaults an innocent man, and you have the audacity to tell us to settle down?" The mayor opened his mouth to respond, but Angela didn't let him. "This is exactly why we're here tonight, because people like you and your family think you can trample on us without consequence." Jordan, still lounging in his chair, chuckled and shook his head. "You're making a scene, Angela, as usual." Angela turned to him, her glare icy. "No, Jordan. You made this scene the moment you walked into this room and disrespected everyone in it. The problem is, you've never had to face the consequences of your actions." "Careful, Angela," the mayor warned, his tone low. "You're treading on dangerous ground." Angela's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Dangerous ground? You mean the kind of ground where people like Marcus walk every single day, constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if they'll be the next victim of someone's abuse of power? That ground?" The crowd roared in agreement again, their anger fueling Angela's words. She turned back to the officer, who now looked visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of dozens of cameras. "You just proved everything we've been saying," she said, her voice steady and cutting. "You proved that the system is designed to protect people like you and silence people like us." Marcus stepped forward again, his voice louder now. "We're not going to be silenced anymore," he said, his words directed at everyone in the room. "Not by you, not by the mayor, not by anyone." Angela glanced at him, pride swelling in her chest. He was bruised, but he wasn't broken, and he wasn't backing down. The officer shifted uneasily, his hand finally moving away from his holster. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Angela replied, her tone razor sharp. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and assault." A woman in the crowd shouted, "He needs to be held accountable." More voices joined in, the chants growing louder. "Accountability! Accountability!" Angela turned to the mayor one last time. "This isn't over," she said firmly. "We'll see to it that justice is served." And with that, the momentum shifted. Angela and Marcus, backed by their community, had turned the officer's act of violence into a rallying cry. The fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. The next morning, the videos of the previous night's incident flooded social media. Clips showing the officer punching Marcus had been shared thousands of times. The hashtags #justice for Marcus and #accountability now trending across platforms. The town's quiet streets were abuzz with whispers, and the mayor's office was inundated with calls demanding an explanation. For the first time, the community's outrage felt impossible to ignore. Angela sat at her kitchen table, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages from journalists, activists, and community members. She scrolled through the flood of posts, each one adding fuel to her growing determination. The system had crossed a line, and this time they wouldn't get away with it. She glanced at Marcus, who sat across from her, nursing a swollen jaw. Despite the physical pain, his eyes burned with resolve. "I'm not backing down," he said, breaking the silence. "They want us to stay quiet, but I won't. Not this time." Angela nodded. "Good," she said, leaning forward. "Because we're not just fighting for you. We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced by this system." Over the next few hours, Angela and Marcus worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build their case. They reached out to witnesses from the meeting, asking them to share their accounts. Angela combed through the footage, noting every detail. The officer's aggressive posture, the moment his fist connected with Marcus's face, the crowd's horrified reactions. She knew they needed a strategy that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. By midday, Angela stood in front of the press outside City Hall, her voice steady and commanding. The crowd of reporters listened intently as she laid out the facts. Last night, a member of our community was assaulted by someone sworn to protect and serve, she began, holding up her leather notebook. This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that enables this behavior and protects those in power. We have the footage, the witnesses, and the truth on our side. Marcus stepped up beside her, his jaw still bruised but his voice unwavering. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, he said. It's part of a pattern. But this time they messed with the wrong community. We're demanding accountability, and we won't stop until we get it. Inside City Hall, Mayor Weston watched the press conference from his office, his face grim. His son Jordan lounged in a chair across the room, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. They're blowing this out of proportion, Jordan said dismissively. It's just a bunch of noise. It'll die down in a week. But the mayor wasn't so sure. He turned to his chief of staff. What's the damage? He asked. It's bad, she replied, holding a tablet displaying the trending hashtags and news coverage. Local, state, even national outlets are picking this up. If we don't address this soon, it could spiral out of control. The mayor sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Schedule a press conference, he said finally. We need to control the narrative. Later that evening, the mayor stood at a podium, flanked by city officials, including the police chief. Cameras flashed as he began his prepared statement. Good evening, he started, his tone somber. Last night's incident at the community meeting was deeply troubling. As your mayor, I want to assure you that a full investigation is underway. We take these matters very seriously, and there will be consequences for any misconduct. Angela and Marcus watched the broadcast from her office, surrounded by a small group of supporters. Angela folded her arms, unimpressed. He's doing damage control, she said. He doesn't mean a word of it. Marcus nodded. They think this will blow over if they sound apologetic enough. But the mayor's statement wasn't the turning point. That came moments later when a reporter asked, Mayor Weston, what do you have to say about claims that your son, Jordan Weston, provoked the incident with inflammatory comments? The room fell silent. The mayor's carefully composed expression faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. I'm not here to discuss my son's actions, he said tersely. This is about ensuring accountability within our police force. The reporter persisted. But doesn't the behavior of those in power, your family included, set the tone for the community? Shouldn't your son be held to the same standards? Jordan, who had been watching from the back of the room, rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. The cameras caught it. The image of his arrogant smirk and dismissive demeanor spread like wildfire online, fueling even more outrage. Angela seized on the moment. She drafted an op-ed that night, highlighting the connections between power, privilege, and systemic injustice. The fish rots from the head, she wrote, and this system is no different. If we want real change, we must hold everyone accountable, no matter how untouchable they think they are. The next day, the pressure reached a boiling point. A coalition of activists and community leaders staged a protest outside City Hall, their chants demanding justice echoing through the streets. Marcus stood at the forefront, holding a sign that read, "Accountability for all." When Angela took the microphone, her voice was unwavering. "This is our turning point," she declared. "This is the moment we say enough. Enough to abuse, enough to privilege, enough to injustice. Change doesn't start in offices like these." She gestured to City Hall behind her. "It starts with us." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a unified force. And as the mayor watched from his office window, he realized this wasn't something he could control. The people were no longer asking. They were demanding. The days following the protest were a whirlwind of change. What began as a small-town incident had grown into a national conversation about systemic racism, police accountability, and the unchecked privilege of those in power. The community, galvanized by Angela's leadership and Marcus's courage, refused to let their demands be ignored. City Hall faced mounting pressure as petitions circulated, calls flooded in, and protests continued daily. Angela, Marcus, and their allies worked tirelessly to ensure that justice was not only served but also seen. Witnesses who had been hesitant at first came forward to share their accounts. Videos from the town hall meeting were compiled into a damning timeline of events, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened. The officer who assaulted Marcus was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of the protest. A week later, after relentless public outcry, he was formally charged with assault. It was a rare moment of accountability in a system that so often protected its own. For Marcus, it was vindication, though he knew this was only one small victory in a much larger battle. Angela, meanwhile, continued to push for broader change. She called for an independent review of the police department's practices and advocated for policies that would protect marginalized communities from similar abuses of power. Her speeches at town halls and protests became rallying cries, her words echoing through the hearts of those who had long felt voiceless. The mayor, desperate to salvage his reputation, issued a public apology. "Mistakes were made," he said in a carefully rehearsed address. "Our community deserves better, and I am committed to ensuring that such incidents are never repeated." But the words rang hollow to many. Actions, not apologies, were what the people demanded. The real turning point came when Jordan Weston, the mayor's son, was called to testify in a public hearing. For the first time, he was forced to answer for his actions. His arrogance and dismissive attitude, so evident in the videos, now worked against him. The public saw him for what he was, a symbol of the privilege that shielded people like him from consequences. Angela sat in the front row during the hearing, her leather notebook in hand. She didn't smile when Jordan fumbled over his words or when the crowd erupted into applause at Marcus's testimony. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there to witness justice being served, not just for Marcus but for every person who had been silenced or dismissed. In the end, the community's fight paid off. The police department implemented new accountability measures, and the mayor announced he would not seek re-election, his career tarnished by the scandal. But, more importantly, the town began to heal. Conversations about race, privilege, and equality grew louder and more honest, breaking through the walls of denial that had stood for so long. As Angela watched Marcus deliver a speech at a rally weeks later, she felt a rare sense of hope. This wasn't the end of the fight. It never would be. But it was a step forward, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. The town was quieter now, but the echoes of change lingered in the air. Marcus walked through the park where the community had gathered so many times before. His bruises healed, but his resolve stronger than ever. Children played on the swings, their laughter a stark contrast to the anger and fear that had gripped the town just weeks ago. Angela sat on a bench nearby, her leather notebook open in her lap. She was jotting down notes for an upcoming panel on police reform, but her eyes kept drifting to the scene around her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the steps they had taken together as a community were proof that change was possible. Marcus approached, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think they'll listen to us this time?" he asked, his tone hopeful but cautious. Angela closed her notebook and looked up at him. "They're already listening," she said firmly. "Now it's up to us to make sure they don't forget." As they stood together, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it a sense of renewal. The fight for justice wasn't just theirs, it was a legacy they were building for generations to come.